On June 10, 1991, just after 8 in the morning, traffic moves slowly along a quiet residential road in South Lake Tahoe, California. And nothing about that morning suggests it will become one of the most infamous missing child cases in American history. Because J.C. Dugard is 11 years old, walking to the school bus stop near her home, carrying her backpack, following the same routine she's followed countless times before, and her stepfather is nearby, watching her from the driveway. When a car suddenly pulls over, a man gets out, and within seconds, the ordinary rhythm of the morning is violently broken because the man grabs JC, forces her into the vehicle, and drives away while her stepfather runs after the car, screaming, helpless, as it disappears down the road. And in that instant, J.C. Dugard vanishes, not into some distant wilderness, but into a nightmare that will last 18 years. And to understand how a child can disappear for nearly 2 decades without being found, you have to look not only at the man who took her, but at the countless moments where the world brushed up against the truth and failed to see it. Because within hours, police are searching South Lake Tahoe, roadblocks are set up, helicopters scan the area, neighbors are questioned, and JC's face begins appearing on flyers, on television, in newspapers, while her family is plunged into a state of shock so deep it barely feels real. And at the center of it all is a single unanswered question. How could someone abduct a child in broad daylight and simply vanish? And the answer begins with a man named Philip Garrido, a convicted sex offender who had already served time for kidnapping and assault, and who should never have been near an unsupervised child, but whose presence in the community went largely unnoticed. And Garrido does not take JC far, because distance isn't his protection, secrecy is. And within hours, JC is transported to a property in Antioch, California, more than 100 miles away, where Garrido lives with his wife Nancy. And behind the ordinary facade of their suburban home is a hidden world constructed specifically to keep a child trapped in plain sight. Because in the backyard, concealed behind fences and structures, Garrido has built a series of sheds, tents, and soundproofed enclosures, creating a space where JC will be confined, controlled, and systematically isolated from reality. And almost immediately, Garrido begins dismantling her identity, telling her that her family no longer wants her, that no one is looking for her, that escape is impossible, and that if she tries to run, something terrible will happen. And JC, terrified and disoriented, is forced to learn new rules for survival, rules that revolve around silence, obedience, and fear. While back in South Lake Tahoe, the search intensifies. Investigators comb the area, interview known offenders, and even question Philip Garrido himself during a routine check. But nothing connects him definitively to the crime. And as days turn into weeks and weeks into months, the case grows colder, the media attention fades, and J.C. Dugard becomes one more missing child among thousands, while all the time she is alive, growing up in captivity. Her childhood measured not in birthdays and school years, but in the shifting moods of her captor, the boundaries of a backyard she is never supposed to leave, and the constant psychological pressure designed to make her believe the outside world no longer exists. And as the years pass, Garrido's control evolves, allowing small freedoms while tightening the mental cage, because he understands that fear alone isn't enough to hold someone for that long, and JC is forced to navigate a reality where survival means compliance, where resistance brings punishment, and where the concept of rescue slowly becomes abstract, distant, almost dangerous to imagine. And while JC's family never stops hoping, never fully stops believing she could still be alive somewhere, the systems meant to protect her continue to fail quietly, because Philip Garrido remains on parole for years without proper supervision, slipping through cracks created by understaffed offices, missed appointments, and assumptions that allow a convicted predator to live unchecked. And this fragile illusion of normality continues year after year, with neighbors unaware of what's happening just beyond their fences, authorities unaware that a missing child is living in a backyard enclosure, and a girl growing into a young woman who learns to survive by suppressing herself, adapting to confinement, and waiting for a moment that may never come. And this is only the beginning of a story that will eventually expose not just a crime, but a catastrophic failure of oversight, trust, and accountability that allowed an 11-year-old girl to remain hidden in plain sight for 18 years. As the days following the abduction turn into months and then into years, J.C. Dugard's life becomes defined by repetition and confinement because Philip Garrido understands that the longer he can keep her isolated, the more fragile her connection to the outside world will become, and the backyard compound in Antioch slowly evolves into a hidden prison, concealed behind fences, tarps, and improvised structures designed to block sound and sight. And JC is kept almost entirely out of view, instructed never to speak loudly, never to draw attention, never to imagine being seen. And from the outside, the property looks unremarkable, just another suburban home with a cluttered backyard. While inside that space, JC grows up without school, without friends, without a future she can picture. And Garrido reinforces his control daily, telling her that her family stopped looking long ago, that the world moved on, that no one would believe her even if she tried to escape. And these lies are repeated so often that they begin to feel like facts, because for a child trapped at 11 years old, time stretches endlessly, and survival becomes about minimizing pain rather than imagining freedom. And during this time, Garrido is supposed to be under parole supervision because he is already a convicted sex offender. But oversight is inconsistent, appointments are missed, warnings are ignored, and at multiple points, authorities come close to uncovering the truth without realizing it. Because Garrido appears unstable but not suspicious enough, odd but not alarming enough, and the system treats him as a nuisance rather than a threat, while JC remains hidden just a few yards away. And as the years pass, she is forced to adapt psychologically, creating routines, dissociating from her surroundings, learning when to speak and when to disappear into silence. And her identity as J.C. Dugard slowly fractures under the pressure, replaced by a version of herself designed to survive captivity. And Garrido's wife, Nancy, who lives in the same house, occupies a deeply disturbing role because she is aware of J.C.'s presence and does nothing to stop it, choosing denial, complicity, or fear over intervention. And this silent acceptance allows the captivity to continue uninterrupted. And eventually, JC is forced to become a mother while still imprisoned, giving birth to 2 daughters who will spend their earliest years knowing nothing but the backyard compound, taught to call Garrido their father, shielded from the outside world the same way JC was. And this creates a new layer of terror, because now JC's survival is no longer just about herself, but about protecting her children from the truth, from their captor, and from a world she no longer knows how to reach. And despite everything, fragments of hope survive in small ways, in stolen moments of imagination, in the act of teaching her children basic kindness, in the belief that somehow, someday, someone will see what's been hidden for so long. Even as the years stretch on, and the possibility of rescue feels more and more like a distant memory rather than a realistic outcome. And all the while, the neighborhood remains unaware. The parole system remains negligent, and the crime continues not because it is invisible, but because no one looks closely enough. And this long, suffocating middle chapter of JC's life is where the true horror of the case exists, not in the moment of abduction, but in the slow erosion of identity, time, and possibility that happens when a child is forced to grow up in captivity, while the world assumes she is gone forever. As JC moves through her teenage years and into early adulthood, the passage of time becomes something abstract rather than measurable, because there are no milestones to mark growth, no graduations, no normal transitions, only the slow accumulation of days inside the same confined space. And Philip Garrido's behavior grows more erratic as the years go on, swinging between moments of grandiose religious delusions and periods of paranoia, during which he convinces himself that the outside world is closing in, and he responds by tightening control, reinforcing rules, reminding JC that discovery would mean disaster for everyone, including her children. And this threat is especially powerful because by now JC's daughters are old enough to understand fear, old enough to ask questions, and JC is forced to manage not only her own trauma, but theirs as well, carefully filtering reality, shielding them from the truth, while simultaneously teaching them how to survive quietly. how to stay hidden, how to obey without drawing attention. And this dynamic traps JC even further, because any attempt to escape now carries the risk of exposing her children to violence or separation. And meanwhile, Garrido's parole supervision continues to unravel in plain sight, because he misses appointment, behaves unpredictably, and openly discusses bizarre beliefs with officials, yet no one ever conducts a thorough inspection of his property. No one insists on seeing the entire backyard, and no one asks the right questions, allowing a catastrophic failure of oversight to persist for nearly 2 decades. And during this time, JC's family continues to live with unanswered questions, her mother never fully accepting the idea that her daughter is gone, keeping hope alive even as years pass, and most people quietly assume the worst. And this emotional limbo becomes its own kind of imprisonment, stretching across generations, while JC herself adapts in ways that are difficult to comprehend from the outside, developing coping mechanisms that allow her to function within captivity, finding moments of purpose in caring for her children, negotiating small concessions from Garrido, and learning how to navigate his moods to reduce danger. And despite the isolation, there are moments when the outside world comes close enough to touch, when Garrido brings JC out in disguise or introduces her to strangers under false pretenses. Moments that are terrifying precisely because they expose her to freedom without offering a way to reach it, reinforcing the idea that escape is both possible and forbidden. And this psychological tension defines her existence, because she lives with the constant awareness that help might be only a few feet away while being completely inaccessible. And it is this prolonged state of suspended hope that makes the case so devastating. Because JC is not simply waiting to be rescued, she is enduring a life constructed entirely around control, silence, and survival, while the institutions designed to protect her repeatedly fail to recognize the danger in front of them. And as the years approach 2 full decades, the conditions that have allowed the captivity to continue begin to shift subtly, not because anyone has uncovered the truth, but because Garrido's instability becomes increasingly difficult to ignore, setting the stage for the moment when a series of overlooked warnings will finally collide in a way that can no longer be dismissed. As the years approach 2 decades since JC's disappearance, Philip Garrido's behavior begins to draw more consistent attention from authorities, not because anyone suspects he is hiding a missing child, but because his mental state becomes increasingly unstable and difficult to ignore. And this instability manifests in ways that finally intersect with the bureaucratic systems that had failed for so long. Because Garrido is required to attend parole meetings, and during these meetings he begins making rambling, incoherent statements about religion, prophecy, and his role in some larger spiritual mission, alarming some officials, but still not enough to trigger a full investigation. And JC remains hidden just yards away during these moments, listening to fragments of the outside world filter in and out, never knowing how close she might be to discovery, while her daughters continue to grow up within the confines of the backyard compound, forming their understanding of reality entirely within that controlled environment. And JC's role becomes increasingly complex, because she must act as both protector and gatekeeper, trying to preserve some sense of emotional stability for her children, while navigating the unpredictable moods of the man who controls all of their lives. And over time, Garrido begins bringing JC and the girls into limited public settings under strict supervision, presenting them as members of a religious group or extended family, disguising their true identities with long hair, clothing, and carefully rehearsed stories. And these moments are among the most psychologically damaging, because they place JC within reach of normal life, while reinforcing the idea that she cannot speak, cannot ask for help, cannot reveal the truth without catastrophic consequences. And the years of conditioning make silence feel automatic, almost instinctive, even as the desire for freedom remains, buried under fear and responsibility. And then, in August of 2009, a seemingly routine parole office visit becomes the turning point that no one could have predicted, because Philip Garrido arrives with JC and the 2 girls in tow, behavior that immediately raises red flags, and the parole officer notices inconsistencies, confusion, and a level of control that feels wrong, prompting a closer look than Garrido has ever faced before. And this time, the system does not look away, because further questioning leads to unease. Unease leads to investigation, and investigation leads authorities back to Garrido's property, where for the first time in 18 years, the backyard is searched thoroughly, and what they find confirms the unthinkable: makeshift structures, evidence of long-term confinement, and the presence of a woman whose identity does not match any record associated with the household. And when JC finally speaks to authorities, when the truth is no longer something she has to carry alone, the weight of nearly 2 decades of captivity begins to surface all at once, and Philip Garrido is arrested, along with his wife Nancy, and the case explodes into the national spotlight, shocking the country. Because the missing child from 1991 has been found alive after 18 years, hidden in plain sight, and the public struggles to comprehend how such a crime could persist for so long without detection. While JC is thrust into a world she barely recognizes, expected to reintegrate into society while carrying unimaginable trauma, and although her rescue is framed as a moment of triumph, the reality is far more complicated, because freedom does not erase conditioning, and recovery is not a single event, but a long, painful process. And as the legal system moves forward, charging Philip Garrido with multiple counts related to kidnapping, sexual assault, and false imprisonment, and charging Nancy Garrido for her role in enabling the captivity, the focus slowly shifts from the crime itself to the systemic failures that allowed it to happen. The missed parole checks, the ignored warning signs, the assumptions that allowed a convicted offender to remain unchecked for years. And while JC begins the difficult work of reclaiming her identity, rebuilding her life, and protecting her children from further harm, the case becomes a symbol of everything that can go wrong when vigilance fades and responsibility is fragmented across institutions. And yet, even as the world finally acknowledges what happened to her, even as justice begins to take shape, the full story is still unfolding, because rescue is not an ending, it is a transition. And what follows will redefine not only JC's life, but the way society understands captivity, survival, and the cost of looking away for too long. After JC is formally identified and removed from the property, the reality of what happened over those 18 years begins to surface in fragments rather than all at once, because trauma does not come out as a clean timeline. It emerges in pieces, memories triggered by places, sounds, questions, and expectations that JC has never had to face before. And while the public narrative frames her rescue as a miracle, JC herself is confronted with a world that feels overwhelming, loud, fast, and intrusive. A world filled with rules, technologies, and social norms that did not exist in the same way when she was taken. And almost immediately, she becomes the center of intense media attention. Cameras following every update, headlines dissecting every detail, commentators debating how such a crime could have gone unnoticed for so long. While JC is placed into protective care with the responsibility of not only healing herself, but also guiding her 2 daughters through a transition that will define the rest of their lives, because the girls have no memory of freedom, no memory of a life that does not revolve around secrecy and obedience, and JC must slowly explain a reality she herself is still trying to understand. And as the investigation deepens, the scope of the failure becomes impossible to ignore, because records show that Philip Garrido was repeatedly flagged for erratic behavior, that parole officers documented concerns but failed to follow through, that opportunities to inspect the property were missed or dismissed, and that no single person is able to be held fully accountable, which only intensifies public outrage. And during court proceedings, Garrido's behavior remains unstable, alternating between denial, religious rambling, and moments of chilling clarity. While Nancy Garrido presents herself as detached and passive, claiming ignorance and fear despite overwhelming evidence that she was aware of JC's presence for years, and these proceedings force JC to confront her captors again, to hear them speak about her life as if it were an abstract concept rather than 18 stolen years. And although the legal outcomes are decisive, with Philip Garrido receiving multiple life sentences and Nancy Garrido sentenced to decades in prison, justice feels incomplete, because no punishment can restore time, and no verdict can undo the damage inflicted during JC's formative years. And beyond the courtroom, the case prompts national discussions about parole supervision, sex offender monitoring, and the importance of vigilance in communities, leading to policy reviews and institutional reforms intended to prevent similar failures. And yet for JC, these changes exist in the background, secondary to the immediate challenge of rebuilding an identity that was deliberately erased, because she must relearn how to make choices, how to trust, how to exist without constant surveillance, and how to define herself outside the role of victim or survivor. And over time, JC chooses to speak publicly on her own terms, writing about her experience not to satisfy curiosity, but to reclaim narrative control, to assert that what happened to her does not belong to the people who took her or the systems that failed her. And as years pass, the intensity of public attention fades, replaced by quieter questions about long-term recovery, about the children who grew up in captivity, about how society supports survivors after the headlines disappear. And this phase of the story, the one that unfolds after rescue and sentencing, is where the true weight of the crime becomes clear, because it reveals that survival is not a moment, but a lifelong process, shaped by what was lost as much as by what was endured. And although JC's name becomes synonymous with endurance and resilience, her story remains a reminder that captivity does not end when the doors open. It lingers in memory, behavior, and identity, long after the world has moved on. And even here, with the legal chapters closed and the facts established, the story is still not finished, because the impact of 18 years of confinement cannot be measured in verdicts or headlines alone. It continues quietly, in ways that are far less visible but no less real. As time passes and the court proceedings conclude, the story shifts into a quieter phase that rarely receives the same attention as the abduction or the rescue, because this is the part where there are no dramatic revelations, only the slow, difficult process of learning how to live again. And for JC, this means confronting the fact that she entered captivity as a child and emerged as an adult with responsibilities, expectations, and a past that the world already knows in detail. And every step forward carries the weight of being observed, judged, and interpreted by people who were never there, while she works with specialists to rebuild a sense of autonomy, learning how to make decisions without fear of punishment, how to set boundaries, and how to trust her own perceptions after years of having reality manipulated. And her daughters face their own challenges, because they must unlearn the only environment they have ever known, adjusting to school, social interaction, and a society that feels overwhelming and confusing. And JC becomes both their anchor and their guide, determined to give them a childhood that was denied to her, even as she struggles with the knowledge that their earliest memories are rooted in captivity. And outside of their private lives, the case continues to influence public policy and professional practice, as reviews of parole supervision procedures reveal how fragmented responsibility allowed Philip Garrido to operate unchecked, prompting reforms that emphasize cross-agency communication, mandatory property inspections, and more rigorous monitoring of high-risk offenders, changes that arrive too late for JC, but stand as an acknowledgement of institutional failure. And over the years, JC chooses carefully how much of herself to share with the public, releasing personal accounts that focus not on sensational details, but on survival, recovery, and the importance of believing victims, reframing her story away from voyeurism and toward understanding. And this act of reclaiming her narrative becomes a form of control that was denied to her for so long, allowing her to exist as more than a symbol of tragedy, while Philip Garrido remains incarcerated for the rest of his life, and Nancy Garrido serves her sentence, their names fading from headlines as public interest shifts elsewhere. And what remains is the legacy of a case that exposed how easily a child can disappear even in a modern society, how warning signs can be normalized, and how long-term captivity can exist not in remote wilderness, but in a suburban backyard, hidden behind routine and assumption. And as the years go on, the story becomes less about a single crime and more about the systems, choices, and silences that made it possible, because JC's survival forces uncomfortable questions about responsibility, vigilance, and the cost of looking away. And although the legal chapters have closed and the public narrative has largely moved on. The true ending of this story is not a single moment, but an ongoing reality, lived quietly by those who survived it, and it stands as a reminder that freedom is not simply the absence of captivity. It is the presence of support, accountability, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. And with that understanding, the long arc of this case finally settles, not into closure, but into a hard-earned sense of continuation, where life moves forward without forgetting what it took to get there.